Brian stopped his delivery route early and started to drive home. He was shirking a lot of responsibilities now. His job, the text messages consistently popping up, which he kept ignoring, the sudden and mysterious pain in his body. He wasn't even sure why he was going home, but his mind was on autopilot. His brain could only grasp one thing. He had just seen the most stunningly beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes on, and he no longer wanted to see another woman's face as long as he lived, for the fear of erasing this important moment from his memory. Brian and Carl were best friends since elementary school. They spent nearly every day together, even now that they were in high school. They had both wanted to spend more time going out on the weekends, and that meant paying for a car, getting food, going to shows, etc. Neither of them had the kind of parents who could afford to give them any allowance or pay their way. And since they weren't bogged down with extracurricular activities at school, they decided to look for part-time work. All their applications were filled out together, because it would be fun to work together. If they ended up stuck in a job they hated, they at least had each other to make the job easier. Carl got the call first. The local pizza place needed a delivery guy, so the store manager, Layla, asked him to come in for an interview. However, the interview proved to be just a formality, because all they needed was someone that was clean and had a valid driver's license. Carl asked if they had another open spot after they'd offered him the job. "No, we have an employee leaving in a couple of months to go to college, but I don't need anyone else right now," Layla said. Carl talked her into hiring Brian under the agreement that they split their hours between the two of them for a while until they could extend both their hours. "That way, you won't have to spend extra time and money on turnover or training," Carl said. Layla reluctantly agreed. In order to kill two birds with one stone, Carl and Brian trained together. They had to fight the urge to make faces at each other and goof off as Layla was going through instructions with them, because things could snowball out of control pretty quickly between the two of them if they weren't careful. "This is the database where we keep the names and addresses of customers. You'll recognize and memorize many of the regulars. Ask for contact info for new customers, then refer back to this when you are preparing your deliveries." The two friends glanced through the list. Brian's eyes were drawn to one item in particular: Perfume Lady. Why doesn't this lady have a name in this system? "They don't know her name, right?" Carl looked at Layla for confirmation. "And she obviously smells like strong perfume. I'd guess that's the only way they can identify her." Layla nodded her head. "While we're talking about entering names in the system, we'll talk about the instructions that customers ask of us. These are important because they keep them happy, so they continue to give us business." Brian read aloud the instructions for Perfume Lady. Quote, "Leave pizza on the doorstep. Take envelope. Walk back to vehicle. Do not turn around and look at the customer." End quote. Brian and Carl looked at each other with their brows furrowed and a grimace on their face. They both laughed. Layla was usually a pretty easygoing and fun manager. She could joke around with the employees and wasn't too hard on them. But when the topic of the instructions came up, she became very stern. She didn't want any employee making a mistake here. There would be consequences for those who didn't take the instructions seriously. "I have so many questions. Why?" Brian started. "Nobody has the answers. Everyone around here has followed the instructions so far. You will follow them as well, because I don't want to get a call from this customer telling me about how one of you didn't follow the instructions. She is our best and most loyal customer. Also, if you follow the rules, it will work in your favor. She tips very generously. The delivery drivers used to get in arguments about who got to deliver her pizza, and it got ugly. I finally had to set up a delivery schedule to give everyone an equal turn. Brian and Carl let it go. Somehow, by a stroke of good fortune, one of the other employees quit within a week of Brian and Carl's hire, so it didn't take long for them to have overlapping schedules. The two boys found themselves in the store on a Friday afternoon before heading out on deliveries. They started the ball rolling on the speculation. She's probably hideous, like really disfigured or something. That's why she doesn't want anyone turning around and looking at her. She's worried someone will judge her or get scared, Brian said. One of the other employees, Cassandra, had been listening to the conversation. She rolled her eyes. It's likely that she's just a local celebrity who doesn't want to be bothered with anyone pestering her for autographs or something. Carl responded, We don't live in LA or anything. Whatever kind of B-grade celebrity she is, she thinks too much of herself, obviously. Besides, I don't worship at the feet of celebrities, so I could look at her and see who she is without really caring to talk to her. I know you're curious, but if you value your job, you'll just follow the instructions and leave her alone. Guaranteed she'll catch you trying to get a look, and she'll call and complain to Layla. Carl's name came up on the schedule first to get a turn delivered to Perfume Lady. Both boys were working that night, and they were gone several hours before they could finish their routes and talk again. Brian was anxious to talk about the delivery with his friend. At the end of the evening, the two went over to Brian's house. So, what happened? It was pretty uneventful, really. I left the pizza on the doorstep. I felt a strong breeze of perfume-tainted wind blow around me as she opened the door. It honestly almost made me throw up, but it seemed like it only took her about 2 seconds to open the door and grab the pizza, then shut it again. Check this out, though. He pulled out the envelope and showed Brian the tips from the evening. Carl's eyes widened and his mouth dropped open. I know, right? He suddenly couldn't wait for his turn to get that delivery route. Brian and Carl spent nearly every day in some kind of competition to see who could come up with the most ridiculous backstory for this customer. The other employees at the restaurant would deflect the conversation whenever one of the boys tried discussing it with them. Brian and Carl decided that it was probably what they did to try to suppress their curiosity about the woman. Either that, or they just didn't find the situation all that interesting anymore. Brian's name finally came up on the desired delivery route. He spent all day thinking about what he would do with his tips from that evening. Carl wasn't anxious to hear from Brian that night. He already knew what to expect when it came to that delivery route. He expected that Brian would probably get the same in tips. What he didn't expect, however, was that his friend would have completely ghosted him for the rest of the night. Carl texted Brian again for the third time. Dude, why are you ignoring me? Please respond. The next day, Carl got a call from Layla in the morning before the store had opened. She was angry. Hey, where's your friend? I've tried calling and texting him several times. I got a call from that customer last night saying that he didn't follow her instructions. I'm kinda irked because I told you guys we can't do that. I basically had to get down on my knees and beg her to keep doing business with us. I wasn't planning on firing Brian, I just want to sit down and discuss this with him. It took a few moments for Carl to respond, because his mind was racing. I don't know, Layla. He won't text me back either. I guess I can go over to his house and see if he's there. Carl knocked on the door and Brian's dad answered. Hey, is Brian here? He won't answer my calls or texts. I'm sorry, Carl. He is at the doctor right now with his mom getting some tests done. Don't worry, he didn't get in an accident or anything. He just had some unexpected pain, so we're trying to see what might be wrong. His mom practically had to drag him out of the house to go to the hospital, though. He's acting strange and being really uncooperative all of a sudden. I'll make sure he gets in touch with you when he gets back to let you know what's going on. Okay, thanks. Oh, just a heads up, our manager Layla might want to talk to you guys about Brian's job. He might get suspended or fired if he doesn't respond to her soon. Carl endured another day of silence from his friend. Then, out of the blue, Brian texted Carl back. The text conversation was brief. I need to see her again. See who? What are you talking about? Your dad said you had to go see a doctor. Are you okay? I need to see her face again. Carl tried asking several more questions, but it was useless. Brian wouldn't respond anymore. Carl tried to continue working. He needed to keep his job. It wasn't just about the money, though. The job was the only way he could investigate the situation with Brian. Layla was hesitant to allow Carl on the desired delivery route, but she knew that it would be unfair to remove him from the schedule. Carl shouldn't be punished for something that wasn't his fault. He still couldn't give anyone answers about Brian. Layla knew he was sincere when he told her that he still wasn't getting texts from Brian. Carl got the route that same weekend to deliver some pizza to Perfume Lady. Layla stopped him at the door. I don't need to remind you to stick to the instructions on this one, Carl. I'm trusting you. It's not just that I don't want to have another uncomfortable conversation with a certain customer, but I also don't want to see you go MIA either. Just be careful. Carl voiced his agreement and left to deliver pizzas. He sat in the darkness of the car's interior for a few minutes, just staring at the front door. Carl had already decided what he was going to do beforehand. He was just trying to build up the courage to do it. Carl thought Brian was more sensitive and probably not as strong as himself. He couldn't think on his feet or handle tough situations the way Carl could. It was for these reasons that Carl had convinced himself that he could deal with whatever was behind that door more effectively than his friend could. He dropped the pizza on the doorstep. He took the envelope taped to the door. He rang the doorbell, then took a few paces out onto the sidewalk in the opposite direction. He turned around and looked. What must have only lasted a split second seemed to last an eternity. The woman was wearing a silk bathrobe. The hood of her bathrobe was draped over the top of a large head of hair. Inside the hood was the most stunningly beautiful woman's face Carl had ever seen in his life. The woman didn't say anything to Carl. He paid no attention to her mood. She only went quickly back inside and shut the door behind her. Carl sat in his car for a while, trying to grasp what he had just witnessed. He couldn't tell how long he'd been sitting there, but only the ping of his phone was able to break him out of his trance. It was a text from Brian. I've made a mistake. Help. Don't look at her. Carl started the car and drove as fast as he could to Brian's house. When he turned the corner onto Bryan Street, he was met with the bright flashing strobe of red and blue lights. He'd hoped that the paramedics weren't at the house where he thought they might be. His heart sank, and a feeling of dread swept over him when he saw them by the curb in front of Brian's house. When Carl got out, he tried pushing past the neighbors, patrol cars, and tape, but the officers on the scene prevented him from going too far. Brian's parents were up on the front porch. They appeared to be getting ready to load into the car and follow the paramedics. Their faces were red and puffy from crying. Carl kept trying to push forward while yelling out to the authorities that he was a close friend. The paramedics emerged from the front door with a stretcher. There was a white sheet covering something on the stretcher, but it didn't look like a body. There were stiff arms and legs underneath, jutting out at the white sheet in all directions. As the stretcher was being lifted up into the ambulance, Carl saw that the white sheet hadn't covered the head completely. Carl was confused. His friend had dark brown hair, but what he saw was some white on top of Brian's head. A bit of salt or calcium seemed to break off and fall to the ground. Was that Brian? As Carl went back to his car, he felt like the joints in his legs had suddenly become very stiff. He thought he might trip and fall. Carl stumbled into his car. He looked below his shorts. His knees seemed to be more pasty white than usual. The feeling inside his legs oscillated between sharp stabbing pain and numbness. He knew what was happening, and there was no way to stop it. Carl was surprisingly unemotional and impartial. He should have been mourning the loss of his best friend. In the recesses of his mind, he knew somehow that the right thing to do at this moment was to talk to his family. Tell them he loved them, or complete some small items on a bucket list that he'd never had the chance to experience. His focus and determination rested on only one thing until his time on Earth had ended. I need to see her again.